And I wonder, especially in light of the fact that Finney's evangelism eventually spawned the widest, the largest, the most widespread flop of evangelism ever recorded in church history ever. In fact, with the time we have left, let me give you a little background of just how Finney's meteoric rise and fall came about. John MacArthur, in his book entitled Does the Truth Matter?, gives a bit of the history that most people today that actually use Finney's method of evangelism are completely unaware of. And so I would encourage you, as you hear this background on Finney, to just listen to the yellow highlighted parts in particular, because I think you will find they are frighteningly similar to the kinds of statements that are used today in the modern church. And in so being, they become almost a prophecy, almost a predictor of how those same kinds of results will occur when people use those very same methods. Again, huge initial responses, large numbers of decisions for Christ, followed by a massive falling away of false converts. So let's catch a little of the story behind the decisional regeneration story that I think many sincere Christians will find shocking. Here's the first part.
Charles Finney was born in 1792 in Connecticut, but lived most of his childhood in Oneida County, New York. His parents were not Christians. Finney grew up largely ignorant of Christian doctrine. He remembered no preaching of a gospel witness in that part of New York, which he called a wilderness, though the historical records indicate there was at least one strong evangelical church in the community. The religion Finney remembered as a child was, he said later, quote, of a type not at all calculated to arrest my attention, end quote. So, much like many modern Christians, at an early age, Finney developed a distaste for what he felt was dry doctrinal preaching. Unaware of the biblical truth found in 1 Corinthians 2:14, that the man without the Spirit cannot accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, Finney attributed his lack of interest to lack of creative, entertaining preaching. In fact, he described the only preacher he remembered from his youth in the following terms, quote, his reading was altogether unimpassioned and monotonous, and although the people attended very closely and reverentially to his reading, yet I must confess, it was, to me, not much like preaching, end quote. Finney characterized the pastor's content as, quote, a dry discussion of doctrine, end quote, and then added, quote, and this was really quite as good preaching as I had ever listened to in any one place. But anyone can judge whether such preaching was calculated to instruct or interest a young man who neither knew nor cared anything about religion, end quote. And so Finney's views that preaching must be entertaining and include much humor and many stories began to be forged, not from Scripture, but from his own personal experiences.
Again, doesn't that sound familiar to the modern church? Finney grew up largely ignorant of Christian doctrine. He developed a distaste for what he felt was dry doctrinal preaching. Why? Because he was unaware of the biblical truth that the man without the Spirit cannot accept the things that come from the Spirit of God. So instead of looking inward and saying, wait a minute, maybe there's something wrong here, he looked outward and said, well, the problem obviously is lack of interest in creative, entertaining preaching. Well, it goes on from there. Listen.
Not long after, a mere 2 years later, Finney began to preach as a full-time pastor. It was, I believe, extremely unfortunate that Charles Finney chose to pursue a preaching ministry immediately after his conversion. Devoid of any solid Christian influence in his early life, he was almost completely ignorant of the Scriptures and of theology. Finney had a brilliant mind, however, and had always been able to hold his own in a theological debate, even with a trained man like Pastor Gale. His legal training had conditioned Finney to think logically, but it had also saddled him with a world of wrong presuppositions. Finney's notions of justice, guilt, righteousness, transgression, forgiveness, responsibility, sovereignty, and a host of other terms were drawn from his legal studies, not from Scripture.
Again, amazingly like the modern church. Men who are almost completely ignorant of the Scriptures and of theology, but brilliant, smart, great communicators, excellent entertainers, out there preaching notions drawn not from Scripture, but from other places. And again, it continues on.
Worse yet, Finney denied that a holy God would impute people's sin to Christ or impute Christ's righteousness to believers. Finney concluded that those doctrines, clearly taught in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th chapters of Romans, were theological fiction. In essence, he denied the core of evangelical theology.
For the sake of time, I have cut out a ton of this history, but that important last line says it all. In essence, Finney denied the core of evangelical theology. That's how he was able to build his false evangelism. Again, listen to this.
In short, Finney had removed God from the equation and replaced it with his own mix of personal experience, legal terms, and ideas, pragmatic, if it works it must be good kind of thinking, and human logic reason. In fact, Finney was the first influential evangelist to suggest that the end justifies the means. He wrote, quote, "The success of any measure designed to promote a revival of religion demonstrates its wisdom. When the blessing evidently follows the introduction of the measure itself, the proof is unanswerable that the measure is wise. It is profane to say that such a measure will do more harm than good. God knows about that. His object is to do the greatest amount of good possible." End quote. And with that human, very unbiblical logic, Finney introduced a movement in modern evangelism that is still affecting us today.
Yeah, he sure did. I mean, did you catch that? That almost sounds so smart, so common sense, doesn't it, at first? You think to yourself, well, yeah, he's saying the success of any measure designed to promote a revival of religion demonstrates its wisdom. In other words, the end justifies the means. Look, the church is packed. We've got 10,000 people. They're falling out of the rafters. They come forward by the droves. It must be of God. That is the cry of the modern church. It makes so much sense. It seems to. And then he says, when the blessing evidently follows the introduction of the measure itself, the proof is unanswerable. What is causing these crowds and these decisions for Christ? It's this new way that we're preaching that discards God's way. It must be working. But the problem is, A, it doesn't line up with Scripture, and B, 10, 15, 20, 30 years later, the proof is in the pudding. The reality is, when people fall away, it's undeniable. And especially when you can match that with what Scripture has warned from the beginning. We need to learn from this. This is the last section. Listen.
Finney's ministry was centered in western New York State. Even during Finney's lifetime, the area was known as the burned-over district because repeated waves of religious fervor had seemed to erase any real concern for the gospel. But in his younger days, Finney always seemed to be able to fan the flames at least one more time. Before long, however, the excitement and fervor of the supposed revival gave way to hardened unbelief and widespread agnosticism. The burned-over district was scorched again and became harder than ever. In fact, since Finney's time, that part of the country has never experienced another revival.
In short, Charles Finney, the father of seeker-friendly altar calls, fabricated a man-made technique that, as Scripture said, had the form of godliness, but was without the power. In other words, he created a carnal way for carnal men to carnally and therefore falsely respond to a half gospel and then not be converted at all. In the final analysis, it was a method of evangelism that had a huge amount of big upfront activity, but in the end bore very little genuine fruit. And even worse is that it hardened literally millions of hearts to the true gospel. That's what he meant by it was the burnt-over district. They started thinking, well, I've already heard this thing about Jesus Christ dying for my sins, and nothing happened. I didn't change when I came to him. But they never really came to him. And that's the danger of it. So if it were to be asked, how did the modern approach to evangelism based on seeker-friendliness and getting people to come forward and make decisions for Christ begin? Well, church history tells us. It began with Charles Finney. And if it were to be asked, so how did Charles Finney's evangelistic approach work itself out in the big picture? How did it stand the test of time? What fruit did it bear? Well, I think it's best answered in Finney's own words. Listen.